Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Merry Beltany, fantasy fiction fans. So, as you probably know, the 1st of May is the day of bright fire. Beltane or Beltany is taken from the English word, the Old English word, bale, B-A-L-E, which means bright white or shining. And Beltany is an ancient festival that sits about halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. Beltany, or Beltane, is mentioned in some of the earliest Irish literature from around 908 AD, and it's associated with important events in Irish mythology. But it's a Gaelic holiday and it's a Celtic holiday, because May the 1st marks the beginning of summer and the date when cattle, upon which the Celtic lives greatly depended, were driven to higher summer pastures. So rituals were performed to protect these valuable herds, as well as to protect any newly planted crops, and also the working folk from bad spirits, and also to encourage the new growth of spring. So special bonfires were kindled, and the flames and the smoke and the ashes from these fires were used for their supernatural protective powers. During a feast on May Day, food and drink would be offered to the fairy folk, who were believed to be more active during this liminal period. And if you want to know some more information about the period of liminality, listen to my episode 13 of Myth and Magic. I'll put the link in the show notes. It is said that before Christianity, druids would make 2 fires, and with great incantations they would drive the cattle between these 2 fires for extra protection. And sometimes a sacrifice was made to the sun god, also known as the Fair Shining One, aka Belanos. Belanos was a deity that corresponded with, or at least he interrelated to, the great god Apollo. Belanos was perhaps the most widely worshipped of all Celtic deities, and is normally depicted riding a chariot across the skies. And obviously, in May, we sense the great optimism of spring, and we find nature, or if you want, the earth goddess, in good spirits. So it's time to celebrate fertility. And in fact, our word for the month of May is taken from the Greek goddess Maia, M-A-I-A, who is the daughter of Atlas and the mother of Hermes, and she's identified with the Roman goddess of fertility, who's known as Bonadea, Bonadea. And similarly, May is the month of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Catholic tradition. And this is probably because May is cognate with the name Mary. So, Merry Beltany, fantasy fiction fans. What is a knight? Just a short while ago I covered what is a peasant, and I've covered what is a king. And it's possible that you've been watching the TV show Nightfall, which is set in 1306, and it's about the Knights Templar. And you'll probably use a knight in your fantasy fiction, or you'll certainly be thinking about using a knight-type stock character in your fantasy fiction. But what is a knight? Well, knighthood is a rank normally granted by a king upon mounted warriors, though the English word has very humble beginnings. The English, or the Old English, knighit, do you remember from the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, knighit? It's spelled C-N-I-H-T, means servant boy. The Old German, knecht, means servant or vessel. And the notion of a knighit as a household servant persisted right through the 11th century, gradually meant a military follower to the king or other superior at around about the 12th century. Our common idea of a knight being a mounted warrior came about during a series of conflicts from 1337 to 1453, known as the 100 Years' War in Europe. And perhaps recognising that once the Franks, which were a post-Roman barbarian state in the area we now call France, employed what they called a comitatus, which was a senior war band tied to a leader by an oath of fealty. And incidentally, it's where we get the expression posse comitatus, the force of the country, as in, the sheriff has come to call out a posse. But going back to comitatus, in fact, comitatus predates Franks and even the Romans, and it actually comes from an Indo-European concept that originates in horse-riding warrior tribes who once thrived on the great steppes, calling each other together under a tribal chief. But anyway, partly influenced by the Roman practice of patronage, which is patrocinium, where an army officer might be handed lands upon his retirement if his service was exemplary, then comitatus in the feudal system that operated across medieval England during the 9th to the 15th century was where a vassal might pledge military service to his superior, often a king, but might be a powerful local lord in themselves, in return for land and compensation and privileges. And I think readers of the Game of Thrones books and Game of Thrones fans will be conversant with this concept that a lord pays a fealty and becomes a trusted patron. But our idea of knights as men in armour, the paladins as they were called, appeared during the reign of Charlemagne in the 8th century. And this was mobile, mounted warriors who would carry out long-range attacks and defences and conquests. And their services were rewarded by grants of land known as benefices. During the course of the 12th century, knighthood became a social rank, with a distinction made between non-noble cavalrymen and noble true knights. The first military orders of knighthood were the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre and the Knights Hospitaller, which were founded after the First Crusade of the Holy Land in 1099, followed by the Order of St. Lazarus, 1100, the Knights Templar, 1118, and the Teutonic Knights, 1190. Although all of these were intended to be monastic orders to start with, whose members would act as a simple soldier to protect pilgrims on their way to the holy places, these orders gradually became more powerful, richer, and more prestigious. You might want to use some knightly terms, K-N-I-G-H-T-L-Y terms. So let's just go through some. A knight bachelor is a knight who fights under another person's banner. A knight banneret is a knight who fights under his own banner. A page, sometimes you hear page boy. A page is an assistant to the knight. A squire is when a page turns the age of 18 and he's eligible to learn the skills required for knighthood, and these are the skills of battle. And knighted, which you'll also hear, is where a squire is knighted on a major holy feast day, after bathing and after a vigil. The squire will be dubbed, and a adornment, Adoubement, is when the knight-elect is touched upon the shoulders with a sword, and he's dubbed a knight. This was what was known as an accolade. And on my show notes, you'll see a picture of the king dubbing a soldier during the Second World War on the battlefield. The other term you might want to use is chivalry. This is when knights take an oath to their liege lord. As I say, the liege lord is normally the king, and were expected to fight bravely and to display military professionalism and to demonstrate courtesy. And you'll also know about tournaments, but you'll probably want to include them. Tournaments are held in the castle grounds, and these were organised so that knights could show off their military skills and their prowess. And heraldry. This was knights that were permitted to wear a coat of arms, that you have heard of, but you would have wondered what it meant. But basically, a knight would be covered in armour. They'd have their full armour on. So how would you be able to tell one knight from another? Well, how you'd be able to tell is because they have a coloured tunic, which is called a surcoat, surcoat, worn over the armour, and this identified them and showed them everybody else their loyalty. So they might have a red cross on them if they were Templars, or black cross on them if they were Knights of St John, or they might have the king's own symbols, which in England would be 3 lions, or they might have their own personal colours. And a similar colour would be shown on the shield and also on the horse saddle blanket or the horse quarter sheet. But knighthood declined by the end of the 16th century, and knights became obsolete because nations created their own professional armies that were quick to recruit and cheap to train and cheap to maintain and easy to mobilise. The problem with the knights is that they became too powerful, too successful, and you couldn't get rid of them if you wanted to. Kings found that they had this huge standing army of knights just waiting around for the next problem, so they had to actually cause trouble. Nowadays, in the United Kingdom, and also in some parts of the world, an honorific knighthood may be conferred by membership of one of the orders of chivalry. One of the orders of chivalry is the Order of the Garter, or through an order of merit. And this is where a knighthood is conferred automatically, or where the sovereign, in this case it would be Queen Elizabeth II, as I speak, would dub a knight bachelor. And wives of knights are entitled to be called lady before their married surname, whereas knights themselves don't have a surname, they just have their first name. So Sir Paul McCartney is Sir Paul, but his wife is Lady McCartney. Were there ever women knights? Well, yes, women have been appointed to the Order of the Garter almost from the start of the chivalric order, and as we've learnt, they were therefore automatically considered knights, because if you were conferred membership of the Order of Chivalry, for example the Order of the Garter or the Order of Merit, then you are automatically a knight. And in the 12th century in Spain, after women bravely defended Tortosa, which is a city in Catalonia, against an attack by the Moors, a special order was created called the Order of the Hatchet, and it was of women knights, and it was instituted in 1149. So if you wanted to add women knights to your fantasy fiction, I would recommend that they were members of the chivalric Order of the Hatchet. What is a knight? What is a threnody, and how will it inspire you to write a better fantasy fiction story? Fiction writers, perhaps with the exception of those who write schlocky revenge thriller flicks, and Kill Bill might be one of those rare examples, seldom treat death and the consequent bereavement as the artistically reverberative gift it can so often be, which is a pity, because treating death and bereavement as a threnody, 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 will immeasurably improve a story, it will dramatically flesh out a character, and it will comprehensively improve a plot line. But what is threnody? Well, a threnody is a piece of art that's been composed as a memorial to something or someone who's dear to us but now sadly departed. And a threnody ought to comprise of an expression of mourning for the character, the time or the place, an examination of the subordinate 5 steps of bereavement, which I'll go into in a moment, a meditative type of writing, some of the writer's own mournful experiences, and grieving over a lost world or a time or a life, for example, grieving over the end of an idyllic rural life or grieving over the end of a happy marriage. So what are the subordinate 5 steps of bereavement? You probably already know these because it's widely discussed, but I'll just go through them with you. The 5 steps of bereavement are 1. Shock and denial. This is where the person refuses to believe that death has happened. And luckily, it's the shortest stage in the 5 steps. Number 2, anger. This is the outrage caused by the loss or the anger caused by the guilt. So this would include survivor guilt. Number 3, bargaining. At this stage, there's an element of internal bargaining and internal negotiation. Number 4, depression. This is a lengthy and perhaps never-ending period, and it's a period of sadness and questioning and distress. And the last stage, which may never be reached, but the last stage is acceptance. The last stage of the mourning process, where a bereaved person gets better and the reality of the loss is understood and finally accepted. So, imagine your character encounters a death. Perhaps it's a death of a close character or a loved one or a family member. And supposing this death occurs during the first half of your book, then I recommend that you should endeavour to treat it as a threnody and explain the nature of that death properly. And do it like this. Number 1, tackle the grief. Have you recounted the heartbreak? Have you recounted that in a poignant and a touching manner? And then turn to the bereavement itself. Have you gone through and worked your way through the 5 steps of bereavement? That may take a couple of chapters. It may take all the way through to the end of the book. Then turn to the introspection and the rumination. Have you explored how the survivor thinks? Is there survivor guilt? What does the survivor want now that they're faced with bereavement? And also explore the nature of fellow feeling. Have you empathised with your character? Do you understand what your character is going through? Make sure that you do, and make sure you explain that. And don't forget that in a threnody, you should use some of your own mournful experiences. And then finally, assess the loss and damage that's been done to the world since the passing. How has the world that you've created been damaged or altered because of the passing of the character? So when you encounter death, make sure that you treat it as a threnody. Wildflower of the week. Henbane, Henbane, and the hen part of its vulgar name has nothing to do with chickens. The hen bit actually has a lot to do with death. It was once used in magic brews alongside mandrake, deadly nightshade, and datura to make an anaesthetic potion. And it's prized for its psychoactive properties by wizards and witches and shaman and necromancers. The Druids probably used henbane, also known as stinking nightshade, as a fumigant, and this is so they could produce slightly noxious fumes that were used to disinfect or purify an area in the same way that Catholics even today use incense. And at Beltane tide, they used henbane to mystically protect cattle. But the herb became demonised during the late Middle Ages, when it became inseparably associated with witchcraft and sorcery. In fact, possession of just a few seeds of henbane could put you away, or even worse, see you burnt at the stake. Although henbane was once one of the ingredients in gruit, Gruit, and gruit is the herb mixture used for bittering and flavouring beer before the introduction of hops. And in fact, henbane has been traditionally used as a flavouring for beers for many hundreds of years. Is this why it's associated with making people go crazy? Because many witch hunters used to say that the witches that they sought were crazy people. Other common gruit herbs, by the way, include sweet gale, mugwort, and yarrow, and I've planted some yarrow in my garden this weekend. Also ground ivy and horehound, Horehound. But back to henbane. Seeds of henbane have been found in archaeological digs at Viking grave sites, and these findings might suggest that Viking marauders, also known as berserkers, might have ingested the plant prior to battle to induce a rage state that made them famously more dangerous. They were famously, crazily dangerous. So there you are. It's making people go crazy again. As a pharmaceutical and a medicinal herb, the plant has long been used by ancient civilizations, going right back to the Babylonians, to help ailments of the bone, rheumatism, toothache, asthma, cough, nervous disease, and stomach pain. Nevertheless, henbane is highly toxic, not only to humans but to cattle and wild animals, and fish and birds. Common effects of henbane ingestion, even at low doses, include hallucinations, dilated pupils, restlessness, convulsions, vomiting, hypertension, nervous disturbances, and farsightedness, which I'll turn to in a moment. Overdosages frequently result in delirium, coma, respiratory paralysis, and then death. The famous murderer Dr. Crippen killed Mrs. Crippen with a dose of henbane in 1910. The hallucinogenic effects of taking henbane were described by a scientist who took the herb himself for a scientific experiment, and he suggested that he saw the sky filled with herds of animals, fluid, formless creatures emerged from the darkness. He heard words that were all wrong and nonsensical, and he said, "And yet they possessed me for some hidden meaning." When tobacco was first discovered by Europeans in the 16th century, it was referred to as the henbane of Peru. Little did anybody know at that stage that Nicotiana, which is what tobacco is, would go on to kill millions upon millions, countless millions more people than Hyoscyamus niger, or otherwise known as common henbane.